They vanished, and the trail went cold. Families begged for answers, but the silence was louder than any siren. These are the missing person cases where the police hit a dead end, leaving loved ones to search for truth in the shadows.
All right, everyone, gather round. I've got a story for you.
The alarm never went off. Julian Sands woke at 4:47 a.m. on January 13th, 2023, not to the gentle chime of his phone, but to something deeper, a pull that seemed to emanate from the San Gabriel Mountains themselves. Through his North Hollywood bedroom window, Mount Baldy's snow-covered peak caught the first whisper of dawn, its summit glowing like a beacon in the pre-dawn darkness. At 65, Julian had learned to trust his instincts. They'd guided him through decades of film roles, from the haunting landscapes of A Room with a View to the darker territories of Warlock. But this morning felt different. The mountain wasn't just calling. It was singing, a low harmonic that seemed to vibrate in his bones. He dressed quietly, careful not to wake Evgenia. His hiking boots, worn soft from countless trails, felt like old friends as he laced them. The weather report had warned of dangerous conditions, high winds, ice, the ever-present threat of avalanches. 2 hikers had already died on Baldy in recent weeks. But the mountain was calling, and Julian Sands had never been one to ignore a call to adventure. At 6:15 a.m., he sent a text to his hiking partner, David. "Going up early. Weather window looks perfect. See you at the summit." He would never send another message. The Baldy Bowl trailhead sat empty except for Julian's silver Toyota, its metal skin already collecting the morning's frost. The parking area, usually bustling with weekend warriors and dedicated climbers, felt abandoned in the winter dawn. Julian shouldered his day pack: water, energy bars, emergency shelter, all the essentials for what should have been a routine climb to the 10,064-foot summit. He'd hiked this trail dozens of times over the past 20 years. Ever since moving to Los Angeles had made him hungry for the kind of wild spaces that reminded him of his Yorkshire childhood. Each time, the mountain revealed something new. A hidden grove of ancient pines, a vista that took his breath away, or simply the profound silence that only comes at altitude, where the air is thin and the world below seems like a distant dream. But today, as he began the steady climb through the initial switchbacks, Julian felt something he'd never experienced on these familiar slopes. The sensation of being watched. Not by other hikers, the trail was empty, but by the mountain itself, as if Baldy had developed a consciousness and was studying him with ancient, patient eyes. His phone showed full bars at the trailhead, but by the time he reached the ski hut at 8,200 feet, the signal had dwindled to a single bar. He paused to check his messages, finding only David's response. "Running late. Start without me. I'll catch up." Julian looked up toward the summit, still shrouded in morning clouds, and made a decision that would define his legacy. He would continue alone. The weather changed with the brutal suddenness that makes the San Gabriel Mountains so treacherous. One moment, Julian was climbing through intermittent sunlight. The next, he was enveloped in a whiteout so complete that he could barely see his own feet. The wind arrived like a living thing, howling down from the summit with a fury that seemed personal. Snow that had been picturesque from a distance became a stinging, blinding assault. Julian pulled his hood tight and continued climbing, using his trekking poles to probe for solid ground with each step. This was when his actor's training served him well. Decades of performing had taught him to find calm in chaos, to locate his center even when the world around him was spinning out of control. He'd played characters who faced impossible odds, who walked into the unknown with nothing but will and determination. Now, at 65, he was living those roles. But even as he drew on reserves of mental strength built over a lifetime, Julian began to realize that this storm was unlike anything he'd experienced. The wind didn't just blow, it seemed to grab at him, tugging him toward hidden crevices and steep drop-offs. The snow didn't just fall, it swirled with an almost intelligent malevolence, erasing his footprints and obscuring the trail markers he'd relied on for navigation. His phone, when he managed to pull it from his jacket with numb fingers, showed no signal at all. The GPS seemed confused, the blue dot representing his position jumping erratically across the screen before disappearing entirely. Julian Sands, who had spent his career bringing fictional characters to life, was about to become a character in a story with no script and no guaranteed ending. Time began to behave strangely on the mountain. Julian's watch read 11:30 a.m., but the light around him suggested either dawn or dusk, a twilight quality that made it impossible to determine direction. The familiar landmarks that had guided him up this trail dozens of times seemed to have rearranged themselves, as if the mountain was reshuffling its features like a deck of cards. He found himself in a small grove of wind-sculpted pines that he didn't remember from previous climbs. The trees formed an almost perfect circle, their branches interlocked overhead to create a natural shelter from the worst of the storm. In the relative quiet of this unexpected sanctuary, Julian stopped to assess his situation. His water bottles were half empty. He'd eaten one energy bar, but had 3 more in his pack. Most concerning was his inability to determine exactly where he was on the mountain. The storm had erased not just the trail, but his sense of the mountain's geography. Every direction looked the same. White snow fading into gray mist, fading into white sky. But there was something else troubling him. Something that went beyond the practical concerns of navigation and survival. As he sat in the shelter of the pine grove, Julian became aware of sounds that didn't belong to any storm he'd ever experienced. Not just the wind's howl, but something underneath it. A rhythmic thumping, like a massive heartbeat, or like footsteps of something impossibly large, walking just beyond the edge of visibility. His rational mind, shaped by decades of careful observation as an actor, tried to categorize these sounds as tricks of the wind, acoustic illusions created by the storm's interaction with the mountain's rocky faces. But another part of him, the part that had always been drawn to mystery and the unexplained, wondered if he had stumbled into something beyond the realm of ordinary experience. By what his watch claimed was 2 p.m., Julian faced a decision that would determine whether he lived or died. The storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it was growing stronger, the wind now carrying not just snow but ice pellets that stung like bullets against any exposed skin. His core temperature was dropping despite his winter gear, and he could feel the early stages of hypothermia beginning to affect his judgment. He had 2 choices: attempt to descend and hope to find the trail, or find shelter and wait for the storm to pass. The rational choice was to go down. Every survival manual, every piece of mountain wisdom, emphasized the importance of not climbing higher in deteriorating conditions. But when Julian tried to determine which direction led down, he discovered something that chilled him more than the mountain wind. Every direction looked like it led up. Standing in the grove of pines, Julian turned in a slow circle, studying the terrain visible through the storm. No matter which way he faced, the ground seemed to slope upward, as if he were standing at the bottom of a vast bowl. But that was impossible. The mountain's topography didn't work that way. He'd studied the maps, climbed these trails, understood the lay of the land, yet his eyes and his body's sense of gravity told him he was trapped in a geographical impossibility. It was then that Julian heard it clearly for the first time. His name, carried on the wind, spoken in a voice that sounded like his own, but deeper, older, as if the mountain itself had learned to speak with his voice. "Julian," the wind whispered. "Julian, come home." And despite every instinct for self-preservation, despite decades of careful living and calculated risks, Julian Sands began to climb toward the summit. What happened next exists in that liminal space between reality and legend, between documented fact and the stories that survivors tell around fires when the wind is howling and the night is dark. Julian climbed through conditions that should have been impossible to navigate. The storm didn't lessen. If anything, it intensified. But somehow he found footholds in the snow, handholds on ice-covered rock, a path that led ever upward toward Baldy's hidden summit. His phone, dead for hours, suddenly came to life with a brief burst of connectivity. GPS data would later show his position moving toward the summit area at 3:15 p.m., but the ping was anomalous, appearing and disappearing so quickly that search teams would later question its accuracy. As he climbed, Julian began to understand that this was no ordinary storm, no simple case of being caught in bad weather. The mountain was testing him, challenging him, asking him a question that could only be answered with his entire being. The question wasn't whether he was strong enough to reach the summit. The question was whether he was ready to become part of something larger than himself, to join the eternal conversation between human ambition and natural power that had been taking place on mountains like this since the first humans looked up at peaks and felt the irresistible urge to climb. With each step, Julian felt himself shedding the accumulated weight of his 65 years. Not physically, but spiritually. The roles he'd played, the acclaim he'd received, the comfortable life he'd built in North Hollywood. All of it fell away like unnecessary gear abandoned on a difficult climb. What remained was pure essence. Julian Sands, human being, in dialogue with forces far older and more powerful than anything he'd encountered on stage or screen. The storm stopped with the same sudden violence with which it had begun. Julian emerged from the swirling snow into a pocket of perfect stillness at what he believed to be Baldy's summit, though the landscape around him bore little resemblance to the mountain he'd climbed so many times before. The snow was pristine, unmarked by any footprint except his own. The air was so clear it seemed crystalline, and the silence so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat. Below him, Los Angeles spread out like a glittering circuit board, but it seemed impossibly distant, as if he were looking down from a much greater height than 10,064 feet. The Pacific Ocean caught the afternoon sun like hammered metal, and beyond it, he could swear he saw the curve of the earth itself. But it wasn't the view that took his breath away. It was the presence he felt on the summit. Not threatening, but vast and ancient and welcoming. It was as if the mountain had been waiting for him specifically, had been calling to him not just today, but for years, perhaps for his entire life. Julian understood, in that moment of perfect clarity, that he had a choice to make. He could attempt to descend, to return to his life in the valley, to continue the trajectory that had brought him to this moment. Or he could accept the mountain's invitation to become something else, something more, something eternal. He thought of Evgenia, waking up in their North Hollywood home to find him gone. He thought of the roles he would never play, the stories he would never tell. He thought of the search teams that would come looking for him, the headlines that would mark his disappearance, the mystery that would surround his final day. And then he thought of the lifetime of stories that had led him to this moment. Every character he'd embodied, every emotion he'd explored, every moment of beauty he'd witnessed and tried to share with the world. Julian Sands, actor, adventurer, seeker of truth and beauty, made his final choice. For 5 months, they looked for him. Search and rescue teams combed every accessible inch of Mount Baldy, using helicopters, ground crews, search dogs, and thermal imaging equipment. They found the traces of other climbers, the detritus of decades of human passage through the mountain wilderness, but of Julian Sands they found nothing. The mountain seemed to have swallowed him whole. Evgenia waited, hope and despair alternating like seasons. She gave interviews, posted on social media, maintained the kind of faith that only comes from loving someone completely. She knew Julian's mountain skills, his careful preparation, his deep respect for the wilderness. If anyone could survive an extended time in the mountains, it would be him. But as winter turned to spring And spring to summer, even the most optimistic searchers began to acknowledge what the mountain had been keeping secret. On June 24, 2023, hikers found human remains in a remote area of Mount Baldy, far from the established trails. The San Bernardino County coroner would later confirm what everyone already knew. Julian Sands had joined the long list of those who had answered the mountain's call and found something other than what they were looking for. The cause of death was listed as undetermined, but those who knew the mountains understood. Some questions don't have answers that fit on official forms. Today, hikers on Mount Baldy sometimes report strange experiences. A voice carried on the wind that sounds like cultured English accent. Footprints in the snow that appear and disappear without explanation. A sense of presence on the summit that feels both welcoming and profound. The rational explanations are plentiful. Altitude-induced hallucinations, wishful thinking, the power of suggestion. But in the community of serious mountaineers, a different story is told. They say that Julian Sands found what he was looking for on that January morning. They say he became part of the mountain's story, joining the ranks of those who chose transcendence over ordinary survival. They say that on clear days, when the light hits the summit just right, you can see a figure standing at the peak, arms outstretched to embrace the sky. Whether this is true or not doesn't matter. What matters is that Julian Sands, in his final role, became exactly what he'd always been. A storyteller, a seeker, a man who understood that the greatest adventures always involve the risk of losing yourself completely. And perhaps, in losing himself on Mount Baldy, he found something that no stage or screen could ever offer. A way to become part of a story that will outlast every review, every award, every measure of worldly success. The mountain keeps its secrets, but sometimes, if you listen carefully to the wind, you can hear it telling the tale of the English actor who came looking for a simple hike and found immortality instead. Julian Sands is still out there, somewhere between the snow and the sky, playing the role of a lifetime. The champagne flute trembled imperceptibly in Dan Rappaport's hand as he stood on the balcony of his Georgetown apartment, 25 floors above the Washington, D.C. streets. Below, the Potomac River caught fragments of the August afternoon sun, its surface rippling like liquid mercury. At 52, Dan had learned to read the weight of silence, and today, the silence felt heavier than Moscow snow. His phone buzzed against the glass table. Another encrypted message, another cryptic warning, another reminder that exile was never truly exile when your past was built on Russian soil. The champagne, Dom Perignon 2008, the same vintage he'd served at Soho rooms when it was the crown jewel of Moscow nightlife, sat untouched, growing warm in the humid D.C. air. 10 years ago, he'd been the king of Moscow nights, the American expat who'd turned a basement into an empire, who danced between oligarchs and opposition leaders with the fluid grace of someone who understood that in Putin's Russia, survival meant mastering the art of being indispensable to everyone and loyal to no one. Now, a decade later, he was measuring the distance between his balcony and the sidewalk below. His dog, Charlie, a golden retriever with eyes that seemed to understand more than any animal should, watched him from the sliding door, tail wagging with the eternal optimism of creatures who believe that tomorrow will always bring their human home. Dan raised the champagne flute toward the setting sun, a toast to no one and nothing, and whispered words that the wind immediately stole. To the weight of choices, and the price of speaking truth. The glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the balcony's marble floor, like the sound of a life breaking apart. The bass line thundered through Soho rooms like a heartbeat, amplified through concrete and steel. Dan Rappaport stood at the VIP section's velvet rope, watching Russia's elite transform his basement creation into their playground. Oligarchs' daughters danced on tables that cost more than most Russians earned in a year, while their fathers conducted business deals worth billions in the private booths Dan had designed to muffle both conversation and conscience. This was his empire. 1,000 square meters of escape, carved from the bowels of Moscow's most expensive real estate, where the wealthy and powerful came to forget that power always comes with a price. Daniel Abramovich. Sergei Tkachenko, his business partner and the closest thing to a friend Moscow's paranoid elite would allow, appeared at his elbow with 2 glasses of Hennessy Parodies. "Look at what we've built. Look at them. They need us. They need this place." Dan accepted the cognac but didn't drink. He'd learned, in his 7 years of building a financial empire in post-Soviet Russia, that clarity was more valuable than camaraderie. "They don't need us, Sergei. They tolerate us. There's a difference." Through the VIP section's one-way glass, Dan watched a table of FSB officers celebrating something: a promotion, an operation, the disappearance of another troublesome journalist. Their laughter had the particular quality of men who were never afraid of consequences, who lived in a world where cause and effect bent to their will. "You worry too much," Sergei said, but his eyes were already tracking the same table Dan had been watching. "We're businessmen, not politicians. We sell fun, not revolution." But Dan was beginning to understand that in Putin's Russia, there was no such thing as apolitical success. Every ruble earned, every relationship built, every moment of prosperity existed at the sufferance of a system that could withdraw its blessing as quickly as Moscow weather could turn from spring to winter. The music shifted to something darker, more aggressive, and Dan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Success in Moscow was intoxicating, but intoxication was just another word for loss of control. And in Russia, losing control meant losing everything. The revolution changed everything, as revolutions do. Dan stood in Independence Square, watching young Ukrainians tear down the symbols of Russian influence with their bare hands, and felt something shift in his chest, a tectonic movement of conscience that he'd been suppressing for nearly a decade. His wife Alina, 7 months pregnant with their daughter, stood beside him with tears streaming down her face. Not tears of sadness, he realized, but tears of recognition, the kind that come when you finally see clearly something you'd been looking at through distortion for years. "This is what courage looks like," she whispered, her Ukrainian accent thick with emotion, as protesters sang the national anthem under sniper fire. "This is what it means to choose dignity over safety." Dan had come to Kiev ostensibly on business. His Moscow empire was crumbling as Putin's circle tightened around foreign assets, and Ukraine represented new opportunities, new markets, new possibilities. But standing in the square, breathing air that smelled of smoke and determination, he understood that this wasn't about business at all. This was about choosing what kind of man he wanted to be. His phone buzzed with messages from Moscow. Threats disguised as warnings, warnings disguised as friendly advice that carried the unmistakable scent of menace. His business partners, some more willingly than others, were being absorbed into the expanding apparatus of state control. Those who resisted disappeared into the bureaucratic maze of tax investigations, regulatory violations, and unexplained legal complications. Those who resisted too visibly simply disappeared. But watching the Ukrainian protesters, Dan felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the weight of moral clarity. These people were risking everything for an idea: that ordinary citizens deserved dignity, that corruption wasn't inevitable, that the future could be different from the past. "We're not going back to Moscow," he told Elena that night, as explosions echoed in the distance, and their unborn daughter kicked against her mother's ribs as if she, too, could feel the electricity of historical change. "I know," Elena replied, her hand finding his in the darkness of their hotel room. "I've been hoping you'd realize that." The next morning, Dan Rappaport began the process of burning his bridges with Putin's Russia. He had no idea that Putin's Russia would spend the next 8 years trying to burn him in return. Washington, D.C., 2016. The FBI debrief lasted 6 hours and left Dan feeling hollowed out, as if agents had reached into his chest and rearranged his internal organs. The federal building in downtown D.C. was all glass and angles, a monument to transparent government that somehow made everything feel more opaque. Agent Sarah Martinez, a woman with prematurely gray hair and eyes that had seen too many people's worst secrets, closed the thick file of documents Dan had provided. Financial records, communication logs, photographs from Moscow's elite gatherings, the complete blueprint of how money laundered itself through Russian nightlife. "This is substantial, Mr. Rappaport," she said, though her tone suggested the weight of what substantial meant in the context of international intelligence. "But you understand that providing this information puts you in a very specific category of risk." Dan understood. He'd crossed the line from successful exile to active threat, from someone Putin's government would prefer to ignore to someone they needed to neutralize. The mathematics of survival had shifted fundamentally. His knowledge was now more valuable than his silence, but also far more dangerous. "My daughter is American-born," he said, though he wasn't sure why that felt relevant. "She'll grow up here, go to American schools, probably never speak Russian fluently. This is her country now." Agent Martinez's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Children have a way of clarifying our priorities, don't they?" Outside the FBI building, Washington, D.C. went about its business with the oblivious energy of a city that believed itself too powerful to be truly threatened. Tourists took selfies in front of monuments, congressional staffers hurried between meetings that would reshape global policy, and Dan Rappaport walked among them like a ghost, carrying secrets that could destabilize governments. His phone showed 17 missed calls from numbers he didn't recognize. His email inbox contained 43 messages from addresses that looked randomly generated. Someone was trying very hard to reach him, and in his world, persistent attention was never a good sign. But for the first time in 2 years, Dan felt something approaching peace. He'd chosen a side, finally and irrevocably. He'd traded the ambiguous safety of silence for the clarifying danger of truth. That night, he held his daughter as she slept, her tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb with the unconscious trust that defines childhood. She would grow up in a world where her father had chosen to be on the right side of history, even if that choice ultimately destroyed him. Some prices, Dan was learning, were worth paying. August 2022. The surveillance was subtle but unmistakable, the kind of professional attention that announced itself through absence rather than presence. Cars that appeared too frequently in his peripheral vision, faces that seemed familiar in contexts where familiarity should be impossible, the particular quality of silence that suggests someone is listening. Dan had been expecting it for months. The war in Ukraine had changed everything, transforming him from a useful intelligence asset into an active security liability. His social media posts supporting Ukraine, his financial contributions to refugee organizations, his increasingly vocal criticism of Putin's regime. Each action had been another step away from the gray zone of protected exile and toward the bright spotlight of direct confrontation. His daughter, now 8, asked him why he seemed sadder lately, why he spent so much time staring out windows, why he sometimes spoke to her in Russian when he'd promised they would only speak English at home. "Daddy's just thinking about old friends," he told her, which was both true and utterly inadequate. His old friends were dying with alarming frequency. Sergei Tkachenko, his Soho Room's partner, had been found dead in his Moscow apartment. Officially a heart attack, though Sergei had been 34 and in perfect health. 3 other Russian businessmen he'd known from the Moscow circuit had died in the past 6 months. Falls from windows, car accidents, sudden medical emergencies that defied statistical probability. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. The government was settling accounts, closing loose ends, eliminating the potential for embarrassing revelations as international pressure mounted over the war in Ukraine. Dan's name was almost certainly on that list. He'd increased his security, hired bodyguards, varied his routines, taken all the precautions that someone in his position was supposed to take. But he also knew, with the clarity that comes from understanding systems of power, that if the government's intelligence services truly wanted him dead, no amount of personal security would save him. The only question was whether they wanted him dead enough to risk the international incident that killing him on American soil would create. On August 12th, Dan received a message through encrypted channels that answered that question with brutal finality. The debts of traitors are always collected. Geography is no protection. Loyalty to America will not save you. He spent that evening writing letters he hoped would never need to be sent, making arrangements he prayed would never need to be executed, and saying goodbye to a daughter who had no idea that goodbyes were being exchanged. August 14th, 2022, 6 p.m. The security cameras on Dan's building experienced simultaneous technical difficulties at 6:17 p.m., a malfunction so precisely timed that it announced itself as intentional. Dan watched the black screens from his apartment's security monitor with the detached fascination of someone observing his own execution. They were coming, and they were no longer pretending to be subtle about it. His go-bag had been packed for weeks. Passport, cash, encrypted drives containing every piece of intelligence he'd gathered over 15 years of navigating Russian power circles. He could be in his car and heading to a safe house within 3 minutes. Could be on a plane to a non-extradition country within 6 hours. But his daughter was asleep in her bedroom, and Elena was at the lab working late on a virology project that might help save lives. Running would mean abandoning them, leaving them vulnerable to retaliation, forcing them to live with the consequences of his choices without the protection of his presence. The elevator in his building had been disabled. The fire stairs were unusually quiet. Too quiet, the kind of silence that suggested professional occupation. They'd cut off his escape routes with the methodical efficiency of people who'd done this before. Dan poured himself that final glass of champagne and stepped onto the balcony, 25 stories above Georgetown. The city spread below him like a circuit board, each light representing someone going about their evening routine, someone who still believed that tomorrow would arrive on schedule. His phone buzzed with a final message: "Jump, or we visit your family next." Charlie appeared at the sliding door, tail wagging with the stubborn optimism of a creature who believed that love was stronger than fear. Dan knelt and tied a note and $500 in cash to the dog's collar. Instructions for the doorman to care for him, contact information for Elena, and a single sentence that contained everything he couldn't say directly. Tell them that some silences are more dangerous than speaking. He opened the balcony door and gently pushed Charlie toward the apartment's entrance, then sealed himself outside. The weight of the choice pressed against his chest like gravity itself had intensified, like the air had turned to liquid. From this height, Washington, D.C. looked peaceful, orderly, protected by laws and institutions that Dan had once believed were stronger than individual malice. He'd spent his adult life learning that money could be converted into power, that power could be converted into influence, that influence could reach across oceans and decades to collect debts that had never been formally acknowledged. But standing on the balcony's edge, Dan finally understood the mathematics of his situation with perfect clarity. His death would send a message to every other Russian exile who'd considered speaking truth to power. His silence would protect his family but condemn everyone who came after him. Some equations had no good solutions. The Metropolitan Police found Dan Rappaport's body on the sidewalk in front of his Georgetown apartment building at 7:43 p.m. on August 14, 2022. The official investigation would last 3 months and conclude with the medical examiner's determination that the manner of death was undetermined. A bureaucratic acknowledgement that some questions have answers that institutions aren't equipped to provide. Charlie was found in Montrose Park 37 minutes later, still wearing the collar with Dan's final message. The responding officer, a dog owner herself, said later that she'd never seen an animal display such obvious distress, as if the dog understood exactly what had happened to his human. Elena returned from the lab to find police cars surrounding her building, and her husband's name being spoken by news reporters with the careful pronunciation reserved for international incidents. She would spend the following months fielding questions from investigators, journalists, and intelligence agencies, each conversation a reminder that Dan's death had created as many mysteries as it had solved. The encrypted drives Dan had prepared were never found. His final letters were never delivered. The intelligence he'd gathered over 15 years of navigating Russian power disappeared into the vast bureaucratic machinery of law enforcement agencies that couldn't publicly acknowledge what everyone privately understood. But the message was received, internationally and unambiguously. Speaking against Putin's regime carried consequences that extended far beyond Russian borders, that reached into the heart of American cities, that could transform a Sunday evening in Georgetown into a geopolitical statement written in blood. Today, Elena Rappaport lives in Kiev with her daughter, working to develop treatments for diseases that have no political affiliation. She gives interviews sparingly, always declining to speculate about the circumstances of her husband's death, always redirecting conversations toward his work supporting Ukrainian refugees and opposing authoritarian corruption. But sometimes, on quiet evenings when her daughter is asleep and the city below thrums with the stubborn energy of a nation refusing to surrender, Elena allows herself to remember the man who chose truth over safety, who traded comfortable exile for dangerous clarity, who understood that some silences are more destructive than any words. Dan Rappaport's death was officially undetermined, but his life was clearly defined. He was a man who learned too late that neutrality is a luxury available only to those whose consciences can bear the weight of willful blindness. He discovered that choosing sides is inevitable, that silence is a form of complicity, that geography provides no protection against the long reach of authoritarian vengeance. In the end, Dan Rappaport became what he'd spent his career avoiding, a symbol. Not of successful exile or financial acumen or the glamorous danger of Moscow nightlife, but of the price that decent people pay when indecent systems decide they've become inconvenient. His daughter will grow up American, as he'd wanted. She'll probably never speak Russian fluently, as he'd predicted. But she'll carry his story, and in carrying it, she'll understand something that many of her generation will never need to learn: that freedom is fragile, that democracy requires constant defense, and that the weight of silence can sometimes become too heavy for a conscience to bear. The champagne glass Dan dropped on his balcony was swept away by building maintenance the next morning, its fragments too small to piece back together. But the sound it made when it shattered, the sharp, crystalline note of something beautiful breaking apart, seemed to echo through the Georgetown evening long after the noise itself had faded. Some sounds, like some truths, carry further than anyone expects them to travel,